Welcome, dear students. In the current session, I will talk about the world wars and their impact on the English language. I hope and expect that by the end of this session, you would be able to understand how and in what ways the world wars had an impact on English language during the 19th and 20th centuries. We may observe some of the words that came into English between 1914 and 1918 as a direct consequence of the World War I. You know, when such a huge calamity would take place, it would have some impact. It would have some direct impact on the language to fulfill the needs of the times, all those human observations and experiences and things that they would come across for the first time. They would demand for a name, and to name them, English needed certain vocabulary. Some of these terms that were introduced during these times were military terms, representing new methods of warfare, such as, you can notice air raid, anti-aircraft guns, tanks, and blimp. Gas mask and liaison office were new combinations. The compounds that were made, the words already existed, the word gas existed, the word mask existed, but since there was a new invention, now to name it, the term gas mask was introduced as a compound. Same is the case to fulfill the needs. These two words were brought together to make liaison officer. In the same way, in the context of the war, the word camouflage was borrowed from French language. It is very interesting that in French it had formerly been a term of the scene painter's craft, but in the changing situations, it got a completely different meaning. There were certain words that, already existed in the language, and they were given new meanings. So, there were different ways of addition to the vocabulary due to the impact of the wars. Some vocabulary was added by completely creating new words to suit the needs, new compounds that did not exist before that, and sometimes there were already old words that existed, but new meanings were given to them. Look at this example, sector. We all are familiar with the sector, the word sector. But in the old, sense, the meaning was of a specific proportion of the fighting line. Same goes for barrage. That was originally an artificial barrier like a dam or a river. Sometimes what happened, certain terms or words, they were shifted, they were moved from the focused or limited use to a more generalized use. For example, the term hand grenade. Actually, it goes back to 1661, but it was during the war that everybody started using the term because there were hand grenades everywhere, there were fights going on and all that. In that context, the term becomes important. Same was the case with the expressions like dugout, machine gun, no man's land. People were not familiar with these senses, the meanings that were attributed to the words this way before that. Now they were used as a common currency. World War II also had some impact on the language. But when we compare the influence of the First World War and the Second World War, the influence of the First World War was far greater than the Second World War, and I think that makes a logical sense for that as well. Why? Because logically in the time sequence, World War came first. Automatically with it, all the technology that was used, all the happenings, the human experiences and the observations and the new things that needed to be named, they were named. The vocabulary was added. it was immediately followed by the Second World War. There was not a huge gap. That is why there was not huge change in terms of technology or science and, other developments. So there were not a lot of new things that were to be added. Naturally, the Second World War did not bring in a lot of new words. It is very interesting that if the First World War is famous for bringing in a lot of new scientific vocabulary and the vocabulary related to military and war, the Second World War was more memorable for the songs related to war. Anyways, terms were expanded. For example, this term, look at this term, air raid, that already existed now by this time, but certain new expressions were added. For example, air raid warning. This was a compound. Blackout, blitz. So, these words were added. In the same way, you can notice furthermore, blockbuster, dive bombing, evacuate, air raid, shelter, etc. So there was a lot of vocabulary still that was added. The addition during the 19th and the 20th century to the vocabulary of the English language was not only with reference to nouns, it was also, for other parts of speech as well. For instance, new verbs were made. New verbs were made from old verbs, and, you would find many examples of that. For example, to spearhead an attack, to mop up, to appease. These were all the new usage. By the way, it is very interesting, the word that we are very much familiar with, commando. This word goes back to the Boer War. However, it was used in specialized ways, and it was only, after the First and the Second World War that we find it in common use. So, my dear students, overall the world wars contributed a lot in terms of vocabulary.